Ever try to buy hand sanitizer back in, like, early 2020?
Oh, yeah?
Shelves were wiped clean.
I remember that.
It felt like the world was ending. And honestly, looking back at the economic fallout, maybe a tiny part of it did, you know? Which is what we're diving into today, those economic ripple effects of the pandemic.
Right.
And we're going deep, folks. We're cracking open Cold War 2.0, Dawn of the Asian Millennium by Andranik Aghazarian.
Okay.
But before you hit that skip button thinking, ugh, geopolitics, I promise this isn't that kind of party, we're zeroing in on Chapter 3, Section 1, his breakdown of the economic crisis.
Yeah, and it's the doozy. What grabbed me about his analysis is how he links the pandemic to, like, these pre-existing weaknesses in the global economy. Like, COVID was the stress test it was never ready for.
Exactly. And Aghazarian doesn't mince words.
Yeah.
He straight up compares the impact to the Great Depression. He even quotes the head of the International Monetary Fund, who said, and I'm quoting here, "We anticipate the worst economic fallout since the Great Depression." So is that just dramatic flair, or is this comparison legit?
It's bold, for sure.
Yeah.
The economic damage from the pandemic, it's undeniable, right? But comparing it to the Great Depression, I think we need some nuance there. See, the globalized nature of our economy now, it means disruptions spread like wildfire compared to the 1930s.
So faster and wider.
Exactly. Imagine that supply chain chaos we saw, but on a global scale.
And speaking of speed, the author points out how governments basically slammed the brakes on their economies with lockdowns. This unprecedented response, his words, not mine, it felt like hitting pause on the entire world. But can you just hit play on a system that complex? What happens to all those gears that were already grinding?
That is the billion-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Lockdowns, it probably prevented total catastrophe, at least in the short term. But the long-term fallout, that's still unfolding. One thing that worries economists is this idea of economic scarring.
Scarring?
Yeah, like businesses shutting down for good, jobs gone forever, leaving this like permanent damage. Think about those 4 lease signs that never went away after the first wave.
Okay, yeah, those are still around. So let's talk long-term consequences. One statistic from this book really threw me. 68% of unemployed Americans qualified for unemployment benefits that were higher than their lost wages.
Wow.
That's a crazy number.
It is a big number, and it highlights something really important. These generous benefits, they were meant to prevent total economic collapse, right? But they accidentally created this situation where, for some people, staying unemployed made more financial sense than going back to work.
Wow. That's kind of wild, especially in fields like, retail, restaurants, hospitality. The author calls it a service sector apocalypse. He even points out that the average unemployed service worker was potentially getting 182% of their previous wages and benefits. Was that even sustainable? And what happens when those benefits run out but the jobs haven't come back?
It shows the impossible situation policymakers were in.
Yeah.
Immediate relief versus long-term solutions. Those benefits, they were a lifeline. But the author, he's pushing for a focus on retraining, supporting struggling industries, tackling the root problems. Otherwise, you risk even greater social unrest. Think about it. People can't provide for themselves, their families.
Yeah.
That frustration's got to go somewhere.
And that kind of leads us into what Aghazarian calls a glimpse into the future, right? Because even as economies reopen, he says a lot of those jobs, especially in sectors that were hurting even before the pandemic, they're just gone. So what does that even mean for like the average person? Are we all going to be stuck in the gig economy, just bouncing between temporary jobs with zero security?
It might not be quite that dire, but COVID definitely accelerated some trends that were already happening. Automation, remote work, that kind of thing. Like he cites this one study that predicts something like a quarter of all jobs in the U.S. could be significantly impacted by AI and automation in the next decade.
Wow.
Yeah, and that shift has a ton of implications, obviously good and bad. Some people might find more flexibility, more autonomy, but others, especially those who can't work remotely, they risk getting left behind. Like imagine being a cashier in a world without checkout lines or a truck driver competing with self-driving vehicles.
Yeah, no kidding. And he talks about the retail apocalypse too, right? Like malls were already struggling before the pandemic even hit. Is this the end of like traditional shopping as we know it? Or can brick and mortar stores reinvent themselves?
I think we're probably headed for some kind of hybrid model. Online shopping is here to stay, but physical stores, they can adapt. They can offer things the internet can't.
Like what?
Like unique experiences, that personal touch, the instant gratification of walking out with your purchase that very second. Think pop-up shops, interactive displays, in-store events.
Right. Make it an event, not just shopping.
Exactly. He really emphasizes adaptability and innovation as key to survival. Businesses need to be like chameleons, constantly evolving.
It's interesting, though, that the author really focuses on the U.S. perspective. But this stuff, automation, remote work, the struggles of traditional retail, these are global trends, right? How might they play out differently in parts of the world that aren't as reliant on consumer spending as, say, the United States?
That's a really great question. And it just underscores how interconnected the global economy really is.
Yeah.
So the U.S. might be on the leading edge of some of these trends, but the impact is going to be felt everywhere. Like developing nations, for example. They might see their manufacturing sectors boom as companies try to diversify their supply chains away from China, which is something he hints at in other chapters.
Okay.
But of course, that could also lead to exploitation if there aren't proper labor and environmental regulations in place.
Right, right.
It's a real tangled web of potential outcomes. And the choices we're making right now, they're going to have consequences for decades. It's like the butterfly effect, but on a global scale.
You mentioned China, and it made me think the book's title, Cold War 2.0, Dawn of the Asian Millennium, that caught my eye, obviously. Does the author see a connection between, the economic fallout of the pandemic and this idea of a new Cold War brewing with China?
Oh, absolutely. This chapter focuses on the economic crisis, but you can't separate that from the geopolitical backdrop he lays out in the rest of the book. He argues that China strategically used the pandemic to advance its own economic and geopolitical goals while, everyone else was just trying to keep their heads above water.
So are we saying that the pandemic wasn't just a health crisis, wasn't just an economic crisis, but also like a geopolitical one?
Exactly. And like with any crisis, there are winners and losers. He suggests that China was one of the few countries that actually came out of the pandemic in a stronger position, both economically and geopolitically,
Right.
which has massive implications for the global balance of power going forward.
This is a lot to process. I gotta say, I thought we were going to be talking about like stimulus checks and unemployment numbers today, but this is so much bigger.
Oh, it totally is. The economic fallout from COVID, it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Right.
To really understand it, we have to look at it through all these different lenses, economic, social, geopolitical.
And I think that's what makes this book so fascinating. It connects those dots. It forces you to look beyond the immediate crisis and really grapple with these long-term consequences.
Precisely. And it really highlights how important it is to be, informed, engaged citizens. Because the decisions that we make, both individually and collectively, in response to crises like this, they're going to shape our world for generations to come.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, that something that started with like a cough, could end up reshaping the entire world. It really shows you how everything is connected. Health, economics, even geopolitics, like we were just talking about.
It's true. You can't separate them. And that's exactly what the author is getting at. The pandemic really drove home just how vulnerable we are in this interconnected world.
And speaking of vulnerabilities, there's this part in the book where he talks about the shift to the gig economy, where instead of traditional jobs, it's all short-term contracts, freelance work, that kind of thing. He seems to think the pandemic really sped that up, made it almost inevitable. Is that a future we should just accept? Or is there a way to build an economy that's more, stable, secure for workers, even with all this rapid technological change?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's something people are really wrestling with right now. I mean, he's right to point out the downsides of the gig economy, income's all over the place, you don't get benefits, it's crazy competitive. But he also talks about how some people like the flexibility, the autonomy, especially younger generations. So it's more about how do we take the good parts of this new way of working and make sure it doesn't leave people vulnerable.
So then what does that look like, practically speaking? How do we actually create a system that works for everyone, not just the few?
It might mean rethinking some pretty fundamental things like how we approach work, social safety nets, that kind of stuff. Think like portable benefits that aren't tied to one company, a stronger social safety net for when people are between jobs or changing careers, and big investments in training and education so people can keep up with the skills that are in demand.
So it's almost like the pandemic, for all the damage it did, it's forcing us to really examine what we want our economy to be, what we value as a society.
Absolutely. Crises have a way of revealing the cracks, right? But they can also create the momentum for real change, real progress. This book doesn't have all the answers, but it gives us a good framework for understanding the challenges, the stakes, as we figure out this new landscape.
So we've come to the surface after our deep dive into COVID's economic fallout. What's the one thing you want listeners to walk away with?
That the decisions we make today, whether it's our own choices or the policies we support, they have a ripple effect. It's more important now than ever to be informed, be part of the conversation, and push for solutions that work for everyone, not just a select few.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We covered a ton today, the domino effect of lockdowns, that whole idea of a new Cold War brewing. It's a lot. But this isn't the end of the conversation, right? We want you to go out there, find different perspectives, do your own research, and most importantly, think critically about what you find. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.